In the late 1970s and early 80s, one of the most popular science fiction TV shows was Battlestar Galactica. We already did an episode of Gone But Not Forgotten that went in depth on that original show, but to sum things up, the show's story would revolve around a distant galaxy where humans have lost the war against the Sylons, an evil race of robots who have destroyed the human homeworld, with the survivors of the war fleeing to find a new home, and their destination being a world where their lost tribe has already traveled to, a planet which would be called Earth. This show would last a total of 24 episodes, and in 1980, the far inferior follow-up series Galactica was created, lasting a mere 10 episodes and seeming to have put an end to the future of Battlestar Galactica. But over the years, many attempts were made to continue the series. Two of the most famous were when star Richard Hatch would invest $50,000 into creating a proof-of-concept trailer, and the second being a revival series from X-Men director Bryan Singer. But both would fail to get off the ground. So the rights would revert to Universal, and the then president of Universal's television division, Angela Mancuso, saw the potential in the franchise, which is when she approached David Icke to adapt Battlestar for a new generation. Icke was a veteran producer with a steady track record of producing some very successful shows, such as Hercules, The Legendary Journeys, and the cult classic American Gothic. Seeing how big a task it would take to bring Battlestar back to life, David would approach veteran Star Trek writer Ronald D. Moore. Moore's direction of the show would begin with a national tragedy, the September 11th attacks, and their negative effects on society. Both David and Ronald realized that Battlestar Galactica had parallels to the terrorist attacks. They knew that this series would be unlike anything else in the sci-fi genre, and their goal was to make it as realistic as possible. The series would be shot in a documentary-like style, the sets were built to look like that of a military vessel, and the characters would be more complex than your standard sci-fi heroes or villains. After speaking to Moore and Icke, Mancuso would give the green light to make a miniseries on the Sci-Fi Network. But before the miniseries would even air, there was some intense hatred from fans of the original series. It all started when Ronald attended the 2003 Galacticon to screen clips of the upcoming miniseries. Once the audience saw it, they began to boo and hiss. They became hostile to Dawson during the Q&A, and former star of the show, Richard Hatch, had to step in to defend Dawson. This anger from Battlestar Galactica fans all stemmed from the drastic changes that Moore and Icke had made with their revival. Its allegory of a post-9/11 society and making Cylons humanoids was seen as cheap and uninspired, but an even bigger controversy was gender-swapping the characters of Starbuck and Boomer. However, many fans would proceed to change their minds after the miniseries aired with massive ratings. It was thanks to this that the show went to series, as well as a clever marketing idea from David Icke. The first thing he did was leave the miniseries on a cliffhanger, knowing that it would entice executives to give the green light to move to series, if the ratings were good. Now, whether or not this was a factor in how the miniseries went to series is unknown. What we do know is that the revival was a game changer for the Sci-Fi Network, as well as a game changer in the entire science fiction genre by critics. Many would say that it was the first sci-fi show to push the boundaries of the genre. People would compare it to such classic TV shows like The Twilight Zone and the original Star Trek series, in how they incorporated social commentary into their stories. The theme that reoccurs in the reviews of Battlestar Galactica, though, was that they didn't hide said commentary. The feeling of bitterness, survivor's guilt, hatred of an unknown enemy, and religious conflict were all presented on the show. The first season of Battlestar would focus on two ideologies: revenge against your enemies and the importance of the survival of a free society. It was particularly interesting to see this play out with General Adama and President Roslin in their uneasy alliance that would eventually turn into a love story. One of the best storylines was in Season 2, with the introduction of Admiral Helena Kane, whose motivation for revenge against the Cylons at any cost would change Adama's views on the war. Though I do agree that Battlestar Galactica did introduce these new themes, I would say that shows like Space Above and Beyond actually did it first. But I cannot deny that Battlestar took it to a new level. But these stories could not work without the fine actors behind the roles. And Galactica's cast was massive, with each actor giving incredible performances. The key to this was that everyone took their role seriously. At the time, sci-fi roles were not as sought after as, say, those of a primetime drama. A role in a sci-fi show was seen as a step down. However, every actor who was cast on this show realized almost immediately that being on Battlestar Galactica was an honor that would lead to greater opportunities in their careers. The clearest example of this was Lieutenant Kara Thrace, aka Starbuck, played by Katie Sackhoff. To say that Sackhoff has the massive career that she has today because of her portrayal as Starbuck is like saying that water is wet. She was the most popular character of the show, overshadowing even the legendary Edward James Olmos. Now, as I stated, one of the most heated complaints about this show before it aired was the gender swap of the original characters. Moore stated that these changes to Starbuck and Boomer were because the original series had few female roles, and he felt that this was unrealistic and limited the appeal to potential non-Battlestar fans. Surprisingly, one of the most vocal critics of this change was the man who originated the role of Starbuck, who wrote an article titled "Starbuck Lost in Castration." It does not take a rocket scientist to figure out from that title what his opinions are in that article. But to his credit, though, he didn't personally attack Katie Sackhoff, and even took a photo with his fellow Starbuck at Starbucks in the documentary Battlestar Galactica: The Lowdown. Now, the reason as to why Boomer's gender was also changed went deeper than that of Starbuck's. Moore felt that making Boomer into a woman would provide more story opportunities when they introduced a female Cylon sleeper agent. It was more interesting to turn a trusted member of this team into a spy than to introduce an entirely new character. Not to mention, it would also catch the audience by surprise when the reveal of Cylon Boomer appears at the end of the miniseries. Grace Park would be praised not just for her portrayal as Boomer, the Cylon sleeper agent, but also as Athena, another Cylon who turned against the other Cylons to help the humans. The main cast would not be the only ones who would jumpstart their career as a result. Guest stars such as Mark Shepard, Rick Worthy, and Callum Keith Rennie would move on to bigger roles on other popular shows. The careers of Lucy Lawless and Dean Stockwell were also revitalized due to their roles on this series. But one of the most memorable guest stars on Battlestar that saw the most benefit for the show was the original Apollo, Richard Hatch, who would gain a new generation of fans with his role as terrorist-turned-politician Tom Zarek. Yet even though the first 2 seasons were praised by critics and fans, Season 3 is when the downfall would begin. A bold choice was made by the creators to have the survivors try and start a new life on a hostile planet, only to end up getting conquered by the Cylons. It started out well, but by the end of Season 3, the show had simply gone off the rails. Controversial choices would be made, such as Baltar being put on trial and then acquitted, a large portion of the cast being revealed to be Cylons, and Starbuck being killed only to be mysteriously resurrected. But the worst choice that was made was the answer to one of the biggest questions of the entire series. From the start of the Battlestar Galactica revival, Gaius Baltar is the scientist who is inadvertently responsible for the destruction of the 12 colonies, as brought about by a Cylon known as Model 6, or Caprica 6, who seduced Baltar into giving her information that allowed them to destroy the colonies, after which Baltar would have visions of 6, who would help him survive the exposure of his crimes and advise him on how to manipulate the crew for personal power. The mystery of what Vision 6 was and her motivations were the most debated by viewers. The two most popular theories were that she was the broken psyche of Gaius or some kind of Sylon program in his head. The mystery would become even more intriguing when we learn that Caprica 6 also had visions of Gaius Baltar. But the truth that would come out would end up dividing the fanbase. That Vision 6 and Vision Baltar were angels. Now the concept of religion was there from the beginning of the show. It was subtle and didn't overshadow the more engaging themes of survival and war. But by the end of Season 3, the series had changed drastically. Religion had taken center stage. Now it was all about destiny, the Cylons' belief in one god, Baltar starting a cult, miracles, a Christ-like child, and angels. As a fan, I simply felt betrayed. I had become enamored with a show about war, survival, dealing with hatred, and trying to find hope in darkness. Now I didn't even know what the hell I was even watching anymore. So how did the show end up like this? Well, it goes all the way back to the original miniseries. As Moore and Ike worked on the miniseries, the mythology of the Cylons was not fleshed out. The basics were that the Cylons and the humans had a war in the past. A truce was called, and the Cylons then attacked the humans, nearly exterminating them. A fleet of ships then escapes to find Earth, while the Cylons pursue them on their tail. And that's all that was planned. In fact, one of the most memorable parts of the series was the tag before every episode that would always end with the words, "The Cylons have a plan." This was suggested to the marketing team by David Icke. When Ronald found out, he went to Icke and said, "But they don't have a plan, David." Icke then replied, "No, trust me. This is marketing. It doesn't matter. We'll figure it out later. There will be a plan someday." And this anecdote sums up the biggest problem with Battlestar Galactica. Essentially, it had succumbed to the old Hollywood cliche of, "we'll fix it in post." Ronald Moore, he said that this freedom of not having a clear plan from beginning to end let the show write itself, stating that this helped it have a fresh take, since the writers were on the same journey as the characters, trying to get to the end. However, Moore would eventually talk about the controversial revelation that Dream 6 and Dream Baltar were magical beings. When someone asked him if they were angels or demons, he would reply, quote, "I think they're both. We never tried to name exactly what the head characters were. We never looked at them as angels or demons. They seemed to periodically say good things or evil things, to save people or to damn people. There was a sense that they worked in the service of something else that was guiding and helping, sometimes obstructing, sometimes tempting. The idea at the end was that whatever they're in service of is eternal and continues. And whatever they are, they too are still around with all of us who are the children of Hera. They continue to walk among us and watch." Moore was also asked why the mystery of why Starbuck came back to life was never explained, and he responded,
It was a process of trying to figure that out, and I think in the end, I opted to not decide because every answer that we came up with was unsatisfying to what I thought she was. And what I thought she was something kind of indefinable. Didn't want her to be an angel, didn't want her to be a Jesus figure that had died and been resurrected, but was the part of the unknowable that had come to us and become tangible. Long story short, at the end, and I was faced with the challenge, how do you define the indefinable? And we debated it a lot. We had a lot of chat in the writer's room towards that last season. What is Starbuck? Is she Gabriel? Is she Jesus? Is she, okay, that's a little too easy. Is she an angel? Is she other analogies we pulled from other religious traditions and theologies on earth? And none of them felt right. It was like every time we gave it a name and every time we said this is what she is, I kind of felt like the mystery was gone and the special quality was gone. And I decided at the end, I'm just not going to say which is, and we're just going to leave the audience with that.
So, in other words, he had no idea how to explain it. And it was easier to just leave it a mystery and try to gaslight everybody into thinking that was a good thing. I think it's this aspect of the Battlestar Galactica franchise that is a great example for any writer trying to create a show themselves. It is incredibly important to have a plan whenever you create a story. The fix-it-in-post mentality cannot sustain a TV series. You can only distract the audience for so long before they start asking questions. And if you don't have answers, things can get ugly. Don't believe me? Go ask a former Game of Thrones fan about how they feel about the ending of that series finale. You are not going to find a lot of people who praise that disaster. But for the Battlestar Galactica miniseries, those first 2 seasons, and the TV movie Razor, it had some incredible writing. I still remember some particularly amazing episodes, such as 33, the first episode of the first season that will make you feel just as exhausted as the crew. Bastille Day, which would involve the fascinating character of Tom Zarek, which posed the question of whether he was a terrorist or a folk hero. And finally, there was the nail-biter that was Pegasus, which introduced the brutal Admiral Kane. There were also some moments that I simply cannot forget, such as when Starbuck tells Adama her role in his son's death, or when Boomer tries to assassinate Adama while she's in a trance. Not to mention the incredible performances of James Callis and Tricia Helfer that were filled with paranoia and raw sexuality. So it's for those reasons that I could never say that the Battlestar Galactica revival was a failure. After the series had ended, attempts were made to continue the Battlestar Galactica universe. A prequel was created by the name of Caprica, which explored the origins of the Cylons, but it was sadly canceled after 1 season. Then there was the 2-hour pilot called Battlestar Galactica Blood and Chrome, which revolved around a young Adama fresh out of the academy. However, it wasn't picked up, so the pilot was instead split off into a web series. And ever since then, the world of Battlestar Galactica has remained closed. A reboot was being developed for Peacock until the network canceled those plans in 2024. There is still talk about possibly being picked up by another network or streaming service, and I personally am on the fence about it. On one hand, I don't think you could capture that same lightning in a bottle that the 2004 revival had. But on the other hand, it would be interesting to see what a fresh pair of eyes could make of this series. If you want to watch the Battlestar Galactica revival, it is a bit of a mess. I was only able to find the miniseries and the TV movie Razor to stream on, of all places, Fandango at Home. Prime Video has the entire series and also Blood and Chrome available to rent, while Peacock is the only place you can watch Paprika. But as for the second TV movie, The Plan, it is nowhere to be found online. Even with all of its flaws, the Battlestar Galactica revival universe is something to still be experienced. It was some groundbreaking stuff, and still stands as some of the best science fiction ever made. So maybe you should hop on board to that old space battleship and witness the fear, the love, and most importantly, the hope that we must all keep alive in the face of darkness. So say we all. Until next time, this is Jesse Shade speaking on behalf of David Arroyo for the JoBlo YouTube network, and we will see you next time for the next episode of Gone But Not Forgotten.
Thank you for clicking on our video, everybody. If you like what you saw here, please make sure you like the video and subscribe and share with your friends who like this sort of content. JoBlo remains an independent company, and we appreciate all of your support.